Throughout history, economies tend to grow, and Australia's is no exception. In a fair and well-functioning economy, you're going to see that growth distributed evenly across all citizens. So, Matt, you've done some research. How's that going? Surely everything's going beautiful, fair, everyone's happy.
Well, it started out that way, but things have changed dramatically. So what this research looks at, and this research was done by Dave Richardson, one of our economists, we've basically broken up the post-war period. So from 1950 till the pandemic in 2019, we've broken that up into 5 periods. And those periods are basically start with some kind of economic crisis or recession, and they end just before the next big economic crisis or recession.
Okay, so periods of economic growth.
Yeah, so basically periods where out of a crisis, the economy grew, and then eventually there was another crisis, so the economy slowed down. So it basically captures all the bits of what economists call the business cycle.
And so you're looking at who is getting that growth. So how is that broken down?
Yeah, so we looked at how much went to the top 10%, so those doing really, really well, the wealthiest and richest part of the economy, and then how much went to the rest, the bottom 90%, the vast majority of people. If you think that things should be distributed, and they absolutely should be, then if we go back to the 1950s, then it definitely was. The vast majority of the economic growth went to the vast majority of people. So the top 10% got a tiny share, only about 4% of economic growth. The 96% went to that bottom 90%, the overwhelming majority. But then things kind of changed ever so slightly into the 1960s and 1970s. But it was still pretty even. So in this decade, we saw that about 16% of economic growth went to the bottom 10%, and the rest went to the vast majority, that 90%.
Yeah, so 84% to the 90%, you'd take that, that's not too bad.
Yeah, it's reasonably even.
Yeah.
And then we move into the 1980s, and things changed dramatically. In the 1980s, about half of all economic growth went to just the top 10%, that small group at the very top, and the other half, roughly, went to the rest of us, 90% of people. So it became very unequal.
So yeah, on paper, those bars, they're reasonably even, but you've got to remember that 48% is going to just 10% of people. The 52% is shared between 90% of people. So that's not even at all, really.
After the 1990s recession and before the GFC, things improved slightly. So now we see about 36% of economic growth, just over a third, going to the top 10%. And the rest going to the bottom 90%. So again, still very unequal. So we've got more than a third of all of the economic growth going to just 10% of people.
And so then after the GFC and before the pandemic, that 10-year period, where are we, Matt? Hit us.
Yeah, then things changed dramatically. Overwhelmingly, all of the economic growth almost went to that top 10%. So we saw 93% of all of the economic growth go to just 10% of people, and the bottom 90% got almost nothing. They only got 7% of the economic growth.
So that's actually obscene. Just take a second to process that. That's 93% of the economic pie going to the richest 10% of people, while the rest of us, the 90%, fight over scraps, 7%. That's actually insane.
Yeah, and that's a big problem, because we often hear politicians and economists and lots of people saying, well, we need to grow the pie, we need to make the pie bigger. And implicit in that idea that this is a good thing is that increase in the pie will be evenly spread or fairly evenly spread across the economy, that everybody will share in that economic growth. But over the last decade, that has not been the case. Almost all of the growth in the pie has gone to just 10% of Australians.
Okay, so we've got some fat cats who are absolutely munching on this pie. How has this happened, Matt? How did we get into this situation?
Yeah, I think this is actually a story about what's happened in our labour market and about wages growth. So for example, the top 10% get a big chunk of their income from big business. So the top 10% own most of the big business in Australia, whereas the bottom 90% overwhelmingly get their income from wages.
So Matt, are you referring here to a change in how business is taking in money? Like, is business getting more and more of the money from the Australian pie?
Yeah, exactly. So if we just look at the last period, the 2009 to 2019, what that period showed us was really stagnant wages growth. Real wages didn't shift almost at all. Wages grew very, very slowly. Workers didn't get much of a share. And at the same time, profits were really, really strong. So what we've seen is the wages share going down and the profit share going up. Now, the profit share is owned by a very small group of people. And so while their income continued to expand, those at the vast majority of people who earn their money from wages didn't see that expansion. And that's, I think, why we've seen a massive shift in how much is going to the bottom 90% and how much is going to the top 10%.
Just to be clear, I'm not in the 10%, but let's say I'm like a franchisor of your local KFC, and I'm going to say, well, Matt, I'm contributing so much to the economy, it's only fair that I get more of the pie. I have more money, so of course it's going to go to me because I'm contributing more.
Yeah, look, and we hear that argument a lot. The problem with that argument is that if we want our economy to be strong, if we want our society to be strong, but let's forget about society, because I'm a cold, heartless economist. I'm only interested in money and economic growth, right? So let's set aside the whole societal benefits. There's huge societal benefits to more even distribution of income. Let's just look at the cold, hard economics of it. We know that societies where that more evenly distribute the benefits of this economic growth grow a lot faster than economies that don't. So if we want our economy to grow faster, if we want our economy to be healthy, if we want, then we're better off having that growth evenly distributed. That will improve our economy, it will make it grow faster. So just looking at it from the economic perspective, this is bad news. Obviously, from a societal benefit, if we want an economy where people trust each other, if we want an economy where people are happy, where we have low rates of crime and things like that, we also know that we should more evenly distribute the benefits of economic growth.
So perhaps good news for the yacht industry, not so good for your local mum and dad kind of chip shops.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the last sort of couple of, the last decade, we've seen, the rise of super yacht constructions. And I saw recently that super yachts have their own lobby group who are talking about the economic benefits of super yachts for the rest of us.
Oh, it's important, Matt. It's important.
It's totally important.
They need their yachts.
And exactly right. And that's what we're seeing in this data, right? So these kind of super luxury items are growing because this top 10% is taking a huge chunk of all of the economic growth and the rest of us are missing out.
All right, Matt, so when I'm looking at this graph, I see the shift starts to happen around the 80s. So what happened then? What changed? Yeah,
so we had a big change in economics in the 80s. So particularly in the 70s, but it really took hold in the 80s. We had this introduction of trickle-down economics, of neoliberalism, the idea that governments should get the hell out of people's lives, and that it's all about free markets and privatise everything. And that's basically when the profit share, if you like, began to explode. We basically made it so the big business could make lots and lots of money, and that came at the expense of workers and wages. And that's why we see the shift, I think, in the 1980s into the 1990s, and it's really come about particularly after the GFC and before the pandemic, and continues to this day.
God, the old trickle down, it's worked so well, hasn't it?
It has. Well, it's worked good for that top 10%.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Probably as intended, working as intended.
As intended, that's right.
So this to me seems like a bit of a absurd scenario. So when we look at other countries, how are they faring? Is this something that's replicated across other comparable economies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we also had a look, particularly in that last period, from after the GFC to before the pandemic, we had a look at some other countries around the world. What we found was that the majority of economic growth in all of these countries, except for China, went to the top 10%. So Australia is not unusual in seeing the majority of the growth go to the top 10%. That said, of the countries we looked at, Australia was still the largest. That was, Australia had the largest proportion going to the top 10%.
And I suppose like comparing ourselves to like the UK, for example, which is not great, they're the second worst on that chart. Still 28% is very different to 7% when we're talking about what the 90% are getting. Like that's still, Australia is so far from the rest of the pack in this scenario.
Yeah, exactly right. Basically, while they did have the majority going to the top 10%, Australia just saw a massive uneven distribution. Basically, the vast majority of people, that 90%, basically got nothing out of the last decade or so of economic growth. And that's simply not the case in other countries.
Can you speculate for us, Matt, as to why Australia is such an outlier when we do the international comparison?
I think it was because our labour market in particular and the rules around how our labour market works, particularly over the last decade, have been terrible. It might surprise people in Australia, but strikes are actually far more common overseas than they are in Australia. It is really hard to strike in Australia. The rules are so bad that the International Labour Organisation, basically the organisation that looks at all of the countries around the world and their labour laws, are always calling Australia out about their terrible rules around striking. Why is that bad? Well, you might think strikes are bad, right? Like, nobody likes a strike. But if workers can't strike, then basically bosses can basically say, well, you have to accept that wage, right?
Yeah,
and there's nothing you can do, suck it up. And so if you've got no recourse at all, then they're forced to accept these lower wages. And the other thing we've seen really in Australia is this rise of precarious work. Now, that has happened in other countries as well, but combined with those kind of labour laws, what we're seeing is Australia is this outlier in that getting terrible, terrible outcomes for workers.
I mean, you just need to look at France and see how successfully they're rioting at the moment over the changes to the pension to see the comparison between Australia.
Yeah, you just wouldn't see something like that in Australia, and it can't happen under our labour laws.